Greetings and welcome back to the second part of Genre Grinder's look at the greatest year in Giallo history, 1971. I'm your host, Gabe, and I no longer have COVID-19. Pause for applause. And with me, once again, is Patrick Ripoll.
Hi, I also no longer have COVID-19, but I had COVID like a year ago.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Not super long COVID. Not
Exactly. I've made a full recovery.
Okay, great. We're going to get right back into it here. So if you need a definition of Giallo or reasons why I picked 1971 and all that kind of context, please listen to part one. The main thing you need to remember here is that I'm the Giallo fan and Patrick is the hater who needs convincing.
The Giallo skeptic is how I like to think of myself. I like to go, are these really worthy? And we'll find out. Yeah, kind of. Some of them, for sure.
Some of them. We were going to split this into 6 and 6. One of them got pushed back. So now we have 7 episodes to cover. So we're going to try to muster it to get through this. So we are going to start with The Fifth Chord, which was released on August 17th, directed by Luigi Bazzoni. In Italian, it is
Giornata Nera per l'Ariete.
And it is AKA Evil Fingers, which is a pretty terrible title, I'll be honest. The plot of this one is a journalist finds himself on the trail of a murderer who's been targeting people around him while the police are considering him a suspect in their investigation. Pretty straightforward. Based on a 1967 pulp crime novel of the same name by David MacDonald Devine. And so this is like a literal example of a Giallo in that it was probably printed with a yellow cover when it was adapted for the Italian market. If you're interested in that novel adaptation, I highly recommend picking up the Arrow Video Blu-ray. And there's a commentary and 2 different featurettes, all of which cover the differences between the book and the movie in pretty good detail. I didn't read the book. I don't know. Did you read the book since we last talked, Patrick?
I did not read the book. I have only read Pride and Prejudice in the past couple years or couple months. It feels like years. It's a long book.
I only read. I just read it every year, constantly.
It's on a loop.
How I get through life is just Pride and Prejudice over and over and over.
I have it on a chain around my neck, and I keep it with me always.
Yeah, when people see you with the headphones on, your earbuds hooked to your old school iPod, it is just a book on tape version of Pride and Prejudice.
People have stopped asking me, hey, what you thinking about? Because the answer is always, oh, that Wickham.
I'll just quickly say about Bazzoni himself before we get into what really makes this a great movie. He was an important member of the pre-Bird with Crystal Plumage Giallo generation. He released a movie called The Possessed that was released in the U.S. as Lady of the Lake and in Italy as La Donna del Lago. And this was in 1965, so pretty much right after the Mario Bava film, The Girl Who Knew Too Much. He co-wrote and directed that one with Franco Rossellini, who is Roberto's nephew and Isabella's cousin. And it was co-written by Giulio Questi, who made Death Laid an Egg a couple years later as a solo writer-director, which I wish came out in 1971 because it's probably the most interesting Giallo ever made. And it's fascinating, still underseen movie just because availability is very recent. It was hard to find that one. But anyway, The Possessed is a murder mystery template. It's an homage to 40s, 50s film noir and 60s art house, really moody, black and white, melodramatic. What makes The Fifth Chord so good, it just right off the bat, I think Patrick would agree, is the photography.
Oh my God. Vittorio Storaro, one of the all-time greatest Italian genre cinematographers, and on the short list for greatest cinematographers of all time.
Correct.
He, in addition to Italian films such as The Conformist and this, and Footprints on the Moon, he also went on to work in Hollywood, doing films like Reds and Apocalypse Now.
The Last Emperor, all 3 of those got him Academy Award noms, or wins, actually.
He also shot the ugliest looking movie I've ever seen, which is Rifkin's Festival, the last Woody Allen movie from 2020. So, you know, he's getting up there in years, but in his heyday,
he can do it all. He can do
In
it
his
all. He can do
heyday,
shit.
Vittorio, yes, yeah, no, that's true. That should be the takeaway there. Is that he could do it all, from bad movies to good movies.
Yeah.
But no, for real, like every shot in this movie, I rewatched it this morning. You'd really have to squint to find a shot that isn't striking in some way. If it isn't gorgeous lighting, if it isn't like crazy set design, if it isn't vivid colors, then there's probably some camera movement that is off kilter or something that you wouldn't expect. And it's just the entire movie, wall to wall, is absolutely stunning.
He actually kind of created a lot of the template here because he shot Bird of the Crystal Plumage, which invented the look that everybody, including people like Lucio Fulci, were trying to sort of mimic. Fulci ends up having his own style that's very distinct, but this was something he had set up. So one of the things that makes Fifth Chord special visually is that it's so different from not only the cinematographer's own look, but the look that most people were trying to mimic at the time. I don't know. You'd be hard. I mean, because the best looking Fulci and Argento and Bava movies are not Gialli, so you would be hard pressed to find a better looking Gialli than the Fifth Chord.
Agreed. But like the other aspect that sort of makes the Fifth Chord a cut above many of its contemporaries is that I do think it really works well, both in terms of actually getting you invested in the characters. I think Franco Nero does a really good job playing this kind of pathetic alcoholic. There are so many Giallo protagonists are kind of like smarmy, know-it-all, like men who just sort of smirk through everything. And Franco Nero in this is just like so sad.
Yeah, well, they're not just guys who smirk for anything, but even like the ones you like are sort of set up to be like everymen. And Franco Nero's character is definitely not an everyman. He's someone every man can relate to, but he's still like he has this classic noir star thing. If I were to call it, like I was trying to in the previous podcast, I was trying to put these into their own categories. I would say this is a hard-boiled mystery type Giallo, which would start to die off pretty quickly after this point. They really became more about being more elaborate about murder scenes and more elaborate about shocks, and just and tried to get as convoluted as possible just for the sake of it. So I think that the Nero character being this sort of throwback to Philip Marlowe character, I think it helps. The main thing it takes from Bird of the Crystal Plumage is this thing that we talked about in the last podcast, where a character in that has seen a murder attempt and he knows he's seen it wrong, so he keeps replaying it in his head. And there's a really dreamy quality to that that then carries over. And so that becomes a plot point in a lot of these movies. It says that the witness saw something, but he saw it wrong, and he can't figure out what's wrong and with what he saw. Like in The Lizard with the Woman's Skin, the whole movie is based around the protagonist not knowing if she's actually the villain or not. And we can't necessarily credit this to Argento alone, because it's at the center of Antonioni's blow up, which some of the publications I've read consider blow up a Giallo, and I guess that makes sense.
At the very least, Blow Up is the kind of international smash hit that everyone who made these movies saw. Whether or not it directly influenced them, they can't claim that they didn't know about Blow Up.
Right. Yeah, it's almost weird because it's almost a deconstruction of Giallo, but Giallo wasn't really a thing to deconstruct yet, which is kind of interesting. Italians kind of do that kind of backwards a way of deconstructing something before it becomes a cliche.
Well, there are Giallo films that I would say sort of feel like L'Avventura. So that was also just an Antonioni thing. He wanted to set up a premise or a plot that you might feel, it might have the feel of like a thriller or a mystery, and then he would very quickly subvert any hope you had of him paying it off or doing something like that. So that's also just like Antonioni in his blood. He wants to deny you what you think you are going to see next.
total dickhead of a filmmaker.
I saw Zabriskie Point last night. It was absolutely astounding. It's so good, but it's like it is also just like, God, that's not what I thought this movie was going to be.
Yeah. So the thing is they reuse that sort of messed, not false memory, but altered memory. And in this case, there's a reason behind it. It's because the character is a drunk. So it's a sort of interesting reading of, it's not like in Birth Plumage, the guy's too freaked out to really know what's going on, and there's a gender stereotype at play, so he's misreading a situation. Or like Lizard in a Woman's Skin, where she's having a psychotic break, so her memory doesn't make sense. He's just wasted all the time, so he can't really trust what he sees, even though he's a reporter and that's literally his job, is to report on the things he sees.
Well, I mean, yeah, you get a little glimpses of him at work, and you get the feeling like he's probably not a very good reporter.
Yeah,
like he's like, people know him and he seems to do his job, but like everybody hates working with him.
like maybe he used to be a good reporter at some point, and so he developed all these relationships.
Well, yeah, the implication is there's a divorce and he's sort of a deadbeat dad, and something went wrong in a previous relationship.
Yeah,
and he just sort of spiraled out of control from there.
And you can like, there's something about the movie where they could add a hard-boiled narration to it and it wouldn't seem out of place. I'm glad they didn't, because then it would feel like a totally different movie. But there is something about the way he's reacting to things that you can almost hear that what's the theme from Chinatown playing in the background.
Sure. The other thing about The Fifth Chord is, as someone who, I came to Giallo as a fan of slasher movies, and my introduction to what even a Giallo was basically it being me being told, oh yeah, they are the thing that turned into slasher movies. So I looked at them primarily as like, okay, how are you going to deliver me the thing that the genre I like delivered me 10 years later? And a lot of these films have no interest in that, and that was sort of a thing I had to get over. But like, this is a movie that it's very scary when it wants to be, and part of that is just the lighting and the camera work is just so superb. This came out the same year as Bay of Blood, which we'll be talking about later, but there's a specific death scene in this that has a very striking similarity to my favorite kill in Bay of Blood, and it is maybe even a little better, just the way it's staged and constructed and drawn out, with the woman in the wheelchair sort of crawling on the floor. That scene is so scary, and honestly, a lot of these movies, you don't get that level of like craft when it comes to building up suspense and like what the character sees and doesn't see and all that sort of thing. And so that aspect of this movie always really impressed me.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about Bay of Blood in a minute, but in Bay of Blood's case, that scene is almost supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be a serious. It's just everything getting just at the very beginning of the movie getting more and more violent all of a sudden. And in the case of The Fifth Chord, they really want us to be upset. It's very. I should say real quick, I did forget earlier to say Bisoni did also direct Footprints on the Moon. That's his third Giallo, which is as different and as the same as the other two. Like, he has a very interesting way of making movies that feel like his movies, but all three of them are very different at the same time. Well, yeah, we already kind of talked about how Franco Nero does make a difference. There is something about Nero that he's such a star. Like, he has that star quality about him that he makes a name for himself doing surprisingly few movies. Like, this is his only real Giallo. He made Django and a couple other westerns in a row, and then he ran away to America because he thought that he got an offer to be in oh god, what was it called, the Bible.
Excalibur?
No, it was first the Bible. And
okay.
So he thought the Bible, and then he was in Excalibur because they liked him in the Bible. And Excalibur was a musical, and he was not up to the task. And so then he had to come back to Italy, and then he just made up a whole nother character, having never been, spaghetti westerns are already out, and so he's in a Policio Tesci, couple of them, Street Law being a big one, that then he becomes really famous in Italy all over again. I guess the other thing, well, okay, I want to say that there are other things that he's lifted from the Argento formula, but it feels so much like his own that it's hard to notice unless you're looking, what does this have to do with Bird of the Crystal Plumage?
One big one is obviously the score.
The score being Mr. Ennio Morricone, who sort of invented the sound of Giallo as much as he invented the sound of spaghetti westerns by doing Bird of the Crystal Plumage. And he sort of kind of mimics himself as they go on. It's something we talked about in the last part of this podcast, that he kind of feels like he has like a folder full of Crystal Plumage outtakes that then he just sells off to other filmmakers.
Sure.
But and then there's also whispered telephone threats was a thing that Argento really liked to do, because the whispering covers the fact if it's a male or female voice. And the climax, which is a foot chase, and it's a series, it's a chase scene, is almost lifted from Crystal Plumage, in a way that's the one thing that feels a little rip-offy, but it's fine, because he also uses Bazzoni uses a musical nursery rhyme to set tension, and mirrors to convey the killer's identity, both of which show up in Deep Red, Argento's 1975 return to Giallo. So Argento clearly saw this movie and ripped off his own shit from it. So all is cool.
Right.
And then the last thing, and I guess we kind of remember, but the last thing that makes this an interesting one is that, and we have to go into spoilers here, and I'm not going to have a timestamp for people to skip, so I'm sorry, we're just going to go into spoilers, is that the reveal is that the killer is gay. And we could have a big, long discussion about homosexuality in Giallo movies in general, and Argento has all sorts of interesting ways of dealing with that. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the filmmakers were as progressive as he was. So the thing that makes Fifth Chord interesting to me is that the killer isn't gay in order to pass off a sort of positive or negative judgment onto LGBTQ people, but as a way to create another wall between the audience and the climactic reveal. It's almost as if heterosexuality becomes another red herring, because we assume that because it's a crime of passion, it has to be a woman who did the killing. But I don't know if that's necessarily a great thing to say, but I think it's interesting in the pantheon of these movies.
It is, and this is true of so many Gialli, that it almost doesn't even register with me anymore. But it is one of those things where the only explanation for the events of the film is that someone is a psychopath, and then at the very end you're told that they were just merely pretending to be a psychopath in order to cover up the actual motive.
Yeah.
Which is one of those things where it's like, you know who would do that? A psychopath. You know who would you know who would kill someone out of anger and then commit 5 more totally demented murders in order to hide the fact that one murder had a different motive? That would be a psychopath. You would have to be just so out of your mind to like go, I got to strangle this kid in this basement so no one... Like no one's caught on to you yet. You're probably in the clear off of that one murder. So anyway, it's one of those things where it's like, it doesn't even register with me. I saw this movie 3 times before I even caught on that the killer was gay, because it is just like a little bit of voiceover at the very end.
Yeah, it's like an extra twist. Like they didn't feel like there was enough. It is a little bit of an afterthought. But it's interesting afterthought it's not interesting in the context of the film itself. It's interesting in the context of not just Giallo, but like exploitation movies, Italian exploitation.
If you look at the nadir of the thing, of being like a post Norman Bates, we have the reveal that the killer is in some way queer, and then they become like sort of a hysterical, shrieking, ridiculous person in the final moments, who is then shot by the police, and normalcy, heteronormative society is once again safe from the queers. Like, if you look at that as like the worst of it, this like barely even, I guess the guy who was jealous and killed out of romantic jealousy, he was jealous over a gay relationship instead of a straight one. Like, I guess that's you could call that normalizing.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's like one of those, it's just like, the way the plot actually wraps up is just so arbitrary that it's hard for me to get a whole lot of meaning or merit out of it either way.
Yeah. It's really just something to put in a in the last paragraph of a review that you're worked really hard on.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on the review.
No.
Really
but
hard
that's the thing. That's the thing, is that it's really, again, it's only interesting as a. It's not an important part of the movie. It's only
Right.
interesting as a larger pattern.
Yeah. No, I can appreciate that.
I was also doing a thing in the previous podcast where I tried to mention if any other important actors were big names in other Giallo movies. So I'll say real quick that Rosella Falk, who got, like many actresses, her start in Fellini's 8½. She's in Umberto Lenzi's 7 Bloodstained Orchids. Alberto De Martino's The Killer is on the Phone, and she has a bit part in Argento's 2001 Giallo, Sleepless. So unless you have something more to say about this.
The lamp that Franco Nero has near his bed is like a $6,000 lamp. It is like a super luxury piece of boutique furniture.
Well, okay, and that opens up the thing that we were talking about, how ugly a lot of the chic furniture is, and the clothing in a lot of these movies, and that is something that actually does make Fifth Court a little bit better. Is not only photographed better, but the chic bullshit is nicer. It
Yes.
looks better, and
Oh my
it
gosh.
looks genuinely expensive, instead of like a bunch of crap they found at the thrift store and threw in just to fill the stage.
The fireplace in the middle of the living room at his ex-wife's house, that's like right next to the spiral staircase. I'm just like, I'm not an interior decorator kind of a person, but I was just like, oh my God, this place is so cool.
Well, that's actually a good segue to the next one, because there is a bit of a Gothic tint, just a smidge of a Gothic tint to the Fifth Chord. But the next one, The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave, released on August 18th, so like immediately after, is a perfect example of how a Giallo film can also be a Gothic film. Directed by Emilio Maraglia. Italian title is
La notte che Evelyn uscì dalla tomba.
And it is AKA The Night She Rose from the Tomb, and Sweet to Be Kissed, Hard to Die.
Great title.
So this is another psychodrama, a Gothic psychodrama with a male protagonist is what I was calling it. Mariglia was largely a second unit guy, and his work as a solo director is pretty obscure, including 3 action movies, 1 Western, and 2 Gothic-tinged Gialli right in a row. The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave and The Red Queen Kills 7 Times, released the next year in 1972. Those were both big hits. Arrow Video released a cool collection with them in there. The Red Queen is actually the better of the 2, but they're both really good. People like The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave because my understanding is it sort of entered the canon because it was it had a copyright issue, and so it ended up on a lot of TV and cheap VHS and DVD things, and it was always sold as a straight horror movie. There's a very EC, or I should say Amicus like cover of a woman holding a severed head. And even the title, The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave, makes it sound like a straight horror movie. And so my assumption is people rented it or saw it on TV assuming they'd see a supernatural horror movie, but still liked it. And so it remained popular. So like they didn't feel ripped off that they didn't really watch a Gothic horror movie.
You know what? It's hard to watch this movie and feel ripped off because it is so nuts. It is so unhinged, and it just delivers so much of what if you are a genre freak. Like, it is just, there's so much sex and so much violence and so many weird twists and character choices that it's got a little something for everybody.
Yeah,
this was one of the ones I was. This is towards the top of my list as far as 1971 Gialli go.
Yeah, and I think I was hesitant to put it on, even though it's popular, just because the director didn't do a lot else. But it is sort of one of the few that people actually have maybe seen in the pre-Blu-ray DVD collector's edition era. I have a funny, there's a great book called Italian Gothic Horror Films by Roberto Curti. there's a 3-part series, and he mentions that it was also notable because Stephen King mentions it in Dance Macabre, the horror genre essay he wrote. He refers to it as an imported Italian turkey, which is a little unfair, but you know.
Here's what I'll say. I was not more than 4 hours ago listening to a podcast about the work of Stephen King, and they were talking about a book they referred to as a turkey. And they specifically called it a turkey because there's just too much stuff in it. And it's like you make the turkey and then you have all this leftover turkey. And there's just like, there's all these little subplots and everything like that. And in that way, in that very specific 2023 podcast that I was listening to, definition of turkey, the night Evelyn comes out of the grave is an absolute turkey. Because again, like, it is a story about a serial killer who's being gaslit, and that's our protagonist. It's like someone's trying to trick this serial killer into think he's going insane.
like yeah, I mean, that's on paper, that's an incredible plot, really.
And then
like,
yeah, and then
that's
it's like
the elevator pitch. It's a great elevator pitch.
This is definitely another one of those movies that is just like, because it has a high body count and because all of the people who get killed in it, not every single person, but a large majority of the people who get killed in it are beautiful women. You just suddenly are like, oh, I know the producer's type, because every woman in this movie has like the most curvaceous body and they all get naked. And it's just for the first 30 minutes, there's like 4 consecutive scenes where you see a different, absolutely gorgeous, curvy naked woman who gets murdered while tied up. And it's like very kinky but just like in a really lowbrow kind of a way.
Well, then, you know, so I've been saving these for the end of each entry, but I will go into who some of these curvy women are.
Oh, they have names. Excellent.
Yeah. The title character, Evelyn, is played by Mariana Malfatti. She is an Italian screen queen of a high caliber, but she spent most of her career in theater. She also appears alongside Carol Baker in The Fourth Victim, which was a sort of ripoff of a Spanish ripoff of the Umberto Lenzi Baker movies. She's then again in Seven Bloodstained Orchids, and Sergio Martino's All the Colors of the Dark, which we talked about previous one, which is a hella banger, as they say. And then she was in The Red Queen Kills 7 Times the following year. So yeah, and she sort of retired from all that to go on to be a really respected stage actress, which is just great. I guess she's the main one, and then the main character, Alan, which is a funny name to me. I don't know why Alan is such a funny name to me.
It takes place in England. It seems like a very normal English name.
Yeah. Maybe it's because it doesn't feel like a normal Italian name,
right?
So it just comes across as weird. That's Anthony Stefan, whose full name is Antonio Luis de Tefe van Hoenholtz, who's a Italian-Brazilian actor. And he did a lot of the peplums and period dramas. And he is maybe the only actor who did knockoff Django, a knockoff Sabata, a knockoff Ringo, and a knockoff Arizona Cult. That might be the record for the most knockoff spaghetti Western characters ever assembled.
He was the Lon Chaney Jr. of the spaghetti Western, where like after the person who originated the role went away, he would come in and do it.
Yeah. And it's funny because I love a lot of the movies he is in, but I always find him such a uniquely boring performer. I mean, it works there's a gothic spaghetti Western he made called Django the Bastard that kind of is a good mix with this one, where he's sort of an actual ghost. Like it's not even just an implied ghost, but an actual ghost. So there's something sort of spooky about his portrayal in that one, and I guess in this one. And then he was in The Crimes of the Black Cat a year later. And then he was in Play Motel, which is a Giallo spoof that is the single worst Giallo movie I have ever seen in my life, and I don't recommend it.
Noted.
So with that out of the way, back to the night Evelyn came out of her grave.
I would say the primary problem with this movie as a mystery is that it is And again, if I had come to this, seeing this on television, thinking this was an amicus British supernatural horror film, this would not be a problem. But I was watching this as part of a series of 1971 Giallo movies,
Mhm.
and I know there's a twist coming. I know
Yeah.
that someone's trying to gaslight him. I know it's not supernatural. And if there was more like of a sort of investigation into the supernatural, if there was like if that aspect, instead of just him going, I think I saw a ghost, and everyone going, oh, I don't know about that, if instead there was like a whole alternate plot line that was the fake supernatural explanation for what was happening, that we learned more and more about, which I guess we kind of do in terms of we learn what happened to his sister, but that's static with him. He doesn't learn anything.
Right.
Just we as viewers kind of understand it a little better. But that might have been a little more engrossing. But there is a point in this movie which I did really enjoy, where if there wasn't something absolutely insane happening, I would go, all right, I know that's not okay. And I was hard to get invested in the story because I know that's not a skeleton lady. I know.
Yeah. Well, it does to try to get highbrow with it, which doesn't really work, but it does pull, actually, I would say, more from gothic romance stories than from giallo stories.
Mm,
It's got a little bit of Rebecca and a little bit of Jane Eyre and a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe in it. It's sort of pulling from those things, but then trying to cram it into this, super exploitative, throw it in theaters and a double bill kind of giallo. I think the closest, one of its closest similarities to giallo movies is it takes a little bit from Diabolique, which is sort of a proto giallo movie if you really
sure.
break it down. But I like that it really does lean into the fact that it's a gothic story, and so some of that ridiculous shit, supernatural things being explained away, is something that sort of happens in gothic stories sometimes, where it is a situation, well, Jane Eyre has some of that gaslighting stuff going on with Christine, what's the name of the wife in Jane Eyre? Yeah, the one locked up in the Emma Poole. It's a little bit of him. Emma Poole, if she was a psychotic man who murders people. I'm trying.
And there was a scene where someone gets devoured by a cage full of coyotes or something. I
Yes.
forgot.
Yeah.
I will say the climax of this movie, in the room where the killers start turning on each other, that is kind of like bleak and upsetting and kind of creepy in a really effective way.
Yeah.
The way it's shot with the camera really low, as we just feel them crawling on the floor and stuff like that. All of that stuff really works well. And then out of nowhere, it goes from this like kind of startlingly effective piece of bleak cinema. It immediately goes into an ending that feels right out of Herschel Gordon Lewis, where there's just
Yes.
like a barrel of acid that someone falls into.
Yeah.
And it's like every Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, the killer is running from the cops and then he just happens to meet a violent death like over the course of 3 seconds. And that
Yeah.
is totally the ending of this movie. And any movie that can combine just like really cheap and tawdry S&M with sort of gestures towards gothic horror and Herschel Gordon Lewis, it has a place in my heart. I have a place in my heart for it.
And well, the movie it reminds me most of, and I don't know if you've seen this, and I maybe should have asked you, have you ever seen Mario Bava's Barren Blood?
A long time ago. No, I've
Yeah,
not seen it in some time.
it's released the next year, and I don't think it's really a giallo. It's really a horror movie with murder scenes. But that movie is about a possibly resurrected murderer who uses torture devices and has this theme of contemporary society encroaching on tradition and antiquity. There are also major characters who are faking the need to use wheelchairs in both movies. I don't know what the meaning is there, but it's sort of interesting that, because Baron Blood is sort of famous among Bava scholars for just ripping off big chunks of House of Wax, and I feel like I uncovered something special when I realized something that needs to be said when I realized how much it has in common with this movie, which is even more popular. This one is brutal but less gory than that one. But yeah, they're foxes. That's right. They're not. I have a note
That's
here
right.
that
I
they're-
was looking in my notes. I couldn't find the animal.
and
Foxes.
and it's one of those gore scenes that was probably shocking at the time, but it really is a sort of Herschel Gordon Lewis thing where it looks like they just went to the butcher and bought up a bunch of animal guts and put them inside a dress and didn't even really try to make it have a human structure.
Yeah.
And the foxes just come in and like, oh shit, there's meat in here. And then they just filmed the foxes eating the animal guts out of the dress.
I agree. It is great.
And then the other movie it sort of reminds me of is I just talked about Giulio Questi's Death Laid an Egg, which is basically like Questi's other movies. It's a social satire, but in that movie the main character is also a tortured wealthy psychopath who is seen torturing women. And again, I'm going to spoil something here, but it's out of context to make us assume that he's a killer. When in that case, he's actually hiring prostitutes to enact his violent fantasies in a safe environment. I think the big like you said, it's about gaslighting. The thing about gaslighting stories is that they're usually about a character we feel bad for.
Right.
That's usually what makes them work, is we're like, oh no. But in this case, it's gaslighting a man who is a murderer at worst and a piece of shit at best. So
And it's also just like an open secret that everyone knows and is just totally accepting of because he's rich, and like that's
because he's rich. Yeah.
Giallo films are always full of casts of really despicable people, but like I've never seen one that has this many people who are literally just condoning the killing of sex workers and other low income people. As just like, yeah, that's just, he's got, he's a weird dude. I agree. He's unusual. Like that. They just sort of write it off. It's bizarre.
Well, and it's funny too, because a lot of these movies, as in the one we're about to talk about, are about a sort of mealy mouthed statement about how much we are supposed to hate rich people. But in this case, it's not really what they're doing with it.
No. If Night Evelyn came out of the grave had a thought in its head, I think I wouldn't like it as much. But I think because it is so head empty that it's very
looks
special.
nice. It looks nice, and yeah, it does have beautiful sets. Like,
yes.
I will say that they found a really nice location. Oh yeah, that is a weird touch. I forgot about that. Christine has a good point there. They really push the real villain of the piece is like, he's presented as a gay guy. He's got like the way he's dressing at the party is in drag. The way he talks, he has that sort of gay villain aesthetic that they had in those movies, but it turns out that he's not. And so I don't know if I watched the extra features on this one when I rewatched it, and that is something that they mention in the video essay, is that nobody's exactly sure what's going on and why they sort of presented this very effeminate's not the right word. This
queer coded.
Yeah, queer coded is the better word. Yeah, this queer coded kind of villain character who is really set up as a villain from the beginning, even though he's pretending to be this guy's friend. You really know who he is. But the fact that he's not actually queer in the end he's sleeping with both of the women in the end. It was a weird choice, and maybe it was one of those things that the actor just wanted to do.
I don't know enough about Italian culture of the era or anything, but I think this is a movie that if it was an American film, I would say, oh yeah, it's a camp film. It's like you view it under the lens of camp.
Yeah, I think that's a fair. I think I'm not I couldn't tell you how. I think camp is popular in Italy. You got shit like Danger Diabolik. Like they loved it's a different kind of camp, but they loved the Batman show and stuff like that. I think that there is I think that the actor knew what he was doing at the very least. Anyway, anything else on this one?
No.
All right. Well, then let's move on to the real Eat the Rich movie of our set here. Umberto Lenzi's Oasis of Fear. This was released the same day, August 18th. The Italian title is
Un posto ideale per uccidere.
and it was also known as An Ideal Place to Kill, which is what it was released as recently on Blu-ray. It was not released as Oasis of Fear. In the US, it's released as a Ideal Place to Kill, which is confusing because there's a different Umberto Lenzi giallo from the next year that is known in Western circles as A Quiet Place to Kill. And this was so confusing that when Severin Films announced a Blu-ray set of the Carol Baker Lenzi movies that included A Quiet Place to Kill, a bunch of people canceled their pre-orders of Mondo Macabro's Blu-ray version of Oasis of Fear under the title An Ideal Place to Kill. And the Severin actually had to tell people, no, it's a different film. And there's actually even more problems with Paranoia versus Orgasmo. If you go back into Lenzi's catalog, it's a lot. But I'm going to call this a home invasion / class warfare type giallo, which are both things that happen in a lot of giallo movies, and is something special to this early era that sort of goes away once giallo movies become more like body count movies and specifically murder mysteries. This is a murder mystery, but not in the same way that is. And some other examples of that sort of class warfare thing is Silvio Amadeo's Amok from 1972 and Aldo Lotto's The Late Night Trains, which is not really a giallo, but very giallo adjacent and a sort of clever, well-made takeoff on the Last House on the Left formula. I think it's probably the best of all those Last House on the Left rip-offs, and probably better than Last House on the Left itself. Obviously not as important, but there's also a bit of that in Ruggero Deodato's House on the Edge of the Park, which is another one that's not really a giallo. It's just sort of a shock horror movie. I can't remember how much we talked about Lenzi in the last episode. This is the only movie of his we're actually covering.
I did watch Paranoia, also known as Orgasmo, in preparation for this one, and it was certainly a edifying experience because they are similar and different in very key ways. Orgasmo is a very similar plot of this sort of rich, isolated woman in her house being taken advantage of by sexy younger people of a lower class. It's spread out over more time. There's other aspects that make them different movies, but at their heart, they're very similar stories they're telling and doing similar things with class as well. I loved this movie. I loved the way it slides from one genre to the next. I love that it starts off as Easy Rider, but instead of selling like speed, they're selling like porn. But it's just like, it's one of those things where if you're a hip audience member in 1971, there's no way that you're viewing these kids as anything but the heroes, because they're like running around Italy in this like repressed Catholic place, and they're spreading their free love and these porn, and they're like, you know, thumbing their nose at the rich in their fancy restaurants with all the money they made, and they're running around and they're in love with each other and they're sexy and fun. And then the way that slides into them being the villains of a home invasion movie, where they like use violence and sexual manipulation to torment this rich woman who has a whole secret of her own. Like that, the way this movie turns into the thing you described, where as like the first 30 minutes or so, it's something totally different. I was so in love with it.
Yeah, and that's the part that's the Orgasmo template, is the that Orgasmo is about people basically manipulating an older woman. I say older, I'm like, she's like my age, but manipulating a woman sexually and abusing her. And that one's really more about lower class kids just playing psychological torture games with a woman.
In both, one of the things that's really interesting is that the woman in question has this sort of anxiety about the world changing around her and her being left behind, and wanting to, it's like ambiguous, like how much of it is do you feel stifled in the way that your generation told you have to be a woman and this is how you have to live your life? You have to be this housewife. You have to take care of this big, beautiful house. You have to be, this kind of woman. These are the acceptable ways you can express sex. And it's like this feeling of lost time that you want to recapture. And then some of it is just like a fear of growing older, that you want to be with the youth again.
Yeah.
There is a interesting psychological component going on with these women in the center of both, that you made a joke about, like, you called her older even though she's your age, but it's like the gap between these characters is just massive. They might as well be from they're from different countries, but they might as well be from different planets.
Yeah.
It's she kind of regards them as like aliens who have landed and are explaining their strange customs and cultures to her.
It's sort of like you took Orgasmo and tried to combine it with a sort of hippie exploitation thing.
Yeah.
But what makes it interesting is the same thing that one of the same things that makes Lizard and Woman's Skin interesting as a weird. I mean, they actually are very similar characters. The Carol Baker character in Orgasmo and the main character in Lizard and Woman's Skin and this character all have that sort of detachment from the youth. And the thing that I think is interesting about it is that so do the filmmakers. The filmmakers really don't. They've been told to do this sort of hippie exploitation thing, and they don't really understand what it's about.
Sure.
So they're
Umberto Lenzi is not Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper.
Exactly. And that actually, I mean, I don't want to say I don't like Easy Rider, because it's fine, but it's a less interesting movie to me because my dad was that kind of guy growing up. So I know those people. I like the idea of seeing these people through borderline conservative Italian man eyes, I think that's an interesting twist on it.
Though I do think Lenzi, at least in the two films of his that I've seen, Lenzi does have a more empathetic, sympathetic, I guess like he has sort of a big picture view of society that it feels much less myopic and sort of limited in the way that like so many of Italian genre films feel extremely heterosexual and extremely masculine.
Yeah.
Lenzi seems to have a little bit more going on in his view of how these sort of elements play together.
Sort of what makes these movies interesting is that there's a world where vertical plumage doesn't happen, and Lenzi's version of Giallo is the popular one because his Carol Baker movies are all very similar and to this one too. And there are other movies like what I just mentioned before, The Fourth Victim, which was a Spanish version of that. There's something that sort of got forgotten for the most part after Vertical Plumage and in the years since, because Argento became kind of a superstar, and then Fulci becomes kind of a superstar like way too late in his life in America and stuff like that. So there's this sort of canon there. These Lenzi movies were sort of forgotten by majority fans for a while because they didn't fit the narrative of what we think of as a Giallo movie. I don't want to say this is the best of all of those. I think that Knife of Ice is probably my favorite of those, because Lenzi, I should say real quick before I lose my train of thought, Lenzi, in terms of sheer numbers, him, Argento, and Martino are the three biggest names in all of Giallo. I would say he made Paranoia, aka Orgasmo. He made So Sweet, So Perverse, Quiet Place to Kill, and Knife of Ice, all with Carol Baker. He also made this film. He made Seven Bloodstained Orchids. He made Spasmo. He made Eyeball. And then years later, he made Hitcher in the Dark, House of Lost Souls, and Nightmare Beach, which are slasher horror movies that still use some of these elements. So he is in a different universe, the main, even more than Bava, the main driving force as a filmmaker behind the genre. And I think that this is a really good. I mean, I had you watch Orgasmo because I think it's important to understand that he was reusing very specific things that he and his co-writers over the years had developed. But I think this is also a pretty good entry point into what those kinds of movies are, because it is a better movie overall. He himself, I have an interview with him in a book called Spaghetti Nightmares, Italian Fantasy Horror as Seen Through the Eyes of Their Protagonists. He says he wanted he doesn't really like this movie, which I think is interesting. He says he wanted Oasis of Fear to be, quote, a thriller that was anti-conformist and which broke the rules. But he blames the cast for coming up short, not himself. He's that type of guy.
Oh, lovely.
So he says he wanted Anna Moffo to be the lead. And late in pre-production, Irene Pappas replaced her. And according to Lenzi, you can't buy Irene Pappas as a credible American wife. And then he doesn't think Ray Lovelock and Ornella Muti, he thinks they were too squeaky clean and not nearly 1968-ish enough to be convincing as hippies. I think these are both absolutely wrong. I think that he is perfectly cast. I think that Irene Pappas is genuinely very good in the film, like not just like good in the way that we say, oh, this was a good performance, for how limited the scope of the story and what is expected from the actor. And I think that Lovelock and Muti are just like perfect young attractive people that are fun to look at, and are good at the fact that we have to dislike them and then like them. Like we have to,
yeah.
I think that one of the most important things that this style of Giallo story, or just of thriller, psychological thriller, is that your audience has to be willing to change its allegiances.
Right. And more than once. This is one of those movies like the Wachowskis' Bound, where depending on who is in control and who is about to have horrible things happen to them, your perspective shifts. And there are parts of that movie where you're like, oh my God, I hope Joey Pantoliano doesn't get caught by the cops. You know, there's like scenes in that movie where you're rooting for him, even though he's the villain. And there's like scenes in this movie where they're clearly the villains, but then at a certain point you learn something about Irene Pappas, and then you go back and you're like, oh my God, they got to get out of there right now. And that sort of ambivalence towards this culture war, that ambivalence towards the different generations. Like if Umberto Lenzi was disappointed that Irene Pappas doesn't come across as all-American, like, yes, I would agree. Irene Pappas does not come across as all-American. Is that important for his film? Absolutely not.
No.
And what she does bring to it, she's absolutely stunning. In a, I think even more than most genre fans, like I tend to be very critical of performances in Italian movies, just because I find the post-sync sound to be such a huge barrier for empathy and like relating to characters. And so I'm not someone who is really has a lot of like Italian genre actors who I am like huge fans of, or performances that really strike me in that way. But like Irene Pappas in this movie is absolutely one of them.
Yeah, and she is like a real class act of an actress. She was in Zerba the Greek and Guns of Navarone and the 1969 film Z, and she has a smaller part in Don't Torture a Duckling. And then she was in the thing I recognized her from, which was crazy, is I don't know if you remember, in 1997 there was a mini series on either ABC or NBC about the Odyssey, starring Armand Assante as Odysseus.
Must have missed.
Do you remember this at all?
I did not.
I was really into the Odyssey for some reason as a 1997, that would have been 17-year-old, so as an early teenager. And then this version of it came on, and I remember watching it very happily, and she's in that. But it honestly, not only is her being a good actress and a class act, it actually works for the exploitation angle too, because it's uncomfortable watching her be exploited.
God. It really is. And like and Lenzi already, I mean, the other Lenzi film I watched was Orgasmo. Like Lenzi's not afraid to push the sexuality. Orgasmo was a bit of a notorious film when it was released in America for its sexual content. It was rated X. But like there is I'm like trying to think of the most polite way to phrase it, but like there is certain audio choices during sex scenes in this that you do not expect to hear in any film that is not hardcore, that I was so scandalized by.
It was interesting because I had seen this movie for the first time not too long ago when it came out on Blu-ray, and I had to review it, and so I didn't feel the need to rewatch it. And then Patrick contacts me on GChat and says, "I wasn't expecting really loud blowjob noises in this movie." And I honestly went, "What? What are you talking about? Is it?" And I didn't remember it, so I had to put in the movie and play both the Italian and English dubs, wondering if. And yeah, it's pretty blatant, and it just didn't I was probably, while I was writing the review, I was probably thinking about, bullshit like I usually do, like whoa, how does this relate to this other Lenzi movie, that kind of crap. So I probably totally missed it the first time around. So
my monocle popped off right into my soup, I will say.
I had to get back to Patrick and say, "Oh yeah, shit, that is pretty extreme." Like I was afraid that the version that I think you were watching a version on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
I was afraid that someone on YouTube, because this has happened to me before, had added sound effects to be gross. Like I've watched YouTube videos of like horror movies with lots of violence, and they some idiots add a bunch of extra goopy noises to things. Excuse me. But yes, it's a scandalous thing that actually really works in the film's favor, because it makes you uncomfortable in the I don't want to say in the right way, because I don't want people to be made uncomfortable by movies if they don't want to be made uncomfortable by movies.
It's a productive way.
There you go. Thank you. It makes it, yeah. And I should say that Lenzi is best as a giallo filmmaker, and he did good Polizio Tesci too. There's a new set coming out, the movies he made with Thomas Milian. He was good with action, but he is most known, unfortunately for him, for I should say he also made Criminal, with a K, Criminal, 1966. He beat Bava's Danger Diabolic to theaters by 2 years, making a very similar film. So he is a trendsetter, but unfortunately one of those trends was he made a 1972 movie called The Man from Deep River, which was released also as Deep River Savages, that was just designed as a sort of jungle adventure ripoff of Man Called Horse, that ended up leading to the entirety of the Italian cannibal genre, which is, I would argue, the Mondo movies are the most revolting things that because they genuinely exploited people,
and granted, some of those cannibal movies sort of blur the line between Mondo and cannibal. Line.
But yeah, so Lenzi's most famous movie is Cannibal Ferox, which is the other, you have Cannibal Holocaust and Cannibal Ferox released right in a couple years in a row, which is just wall-to-wall grotesqueness. And he says nice things about it more recently, like when he had to do Blu-ray and DVD commentary tracks and stuff. But he for a long time was not particularly proud of those movies, and really did. There's a great I have an old Fangoria with an interview with him, and he says something along the lines of, like, I get mail all the time where people tell me Cannibal Ferox is their best movie ever made, and I'm just like, what about Goodfellas? So yeah, it's easy to forget or not even know that Lenzi was at one point an important filmmaker who helped usher in an entire decade of movies, or 2 decades of movies in Italy. Well, really, I guess the late 60s and through the 70s, he was a very important filmmaker. I guess the thing I want to close it out with is that Ray Lovelock. I talked about Ray Lovelock was a interesting performer who he actually recently passed away. He was half English, half Italian, and he was very pretty. And he blew up during the Polizio Tesci era. But he has a really great bit part in Quisti's Django Kill If You Live Shoot, which is, I would say, the most horror themed spaghetti western ever made. And he is the lead in Jorge Grau's pre Dawn of the Dead zombie classic, Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, sometimes known as Breakfast at Manchester Morgue. And he had there's a Armando Crispino giallo called Autopsy that is uniquely misogynistic, to the point where I'm not even sure if it is misogynistic, because it takes it to a degree. So you might not want to watch that one. And then he was also in Play Motel, which, as I said previously, is the worst giallo I've ever seen. So ignore that one. Well, then let's move on to one that I've actually covered with Patrick twice now.
Yeah,
we did the Bay of Blood. We did this on the Directors Club podcast, which I think was the second one I ever recorded with you. I think we did Argento first, and then the first episode of Genre Grinder, when I was trying to figure it out, we did a proto slashers, and we covered it kind of at length in that one too. So don't think we need to cover this one too long.
It is also probably, if you are someone who is not a giallo fan, but you are a larger genre horror fan, Bay of Blood is one of the four you're likely to have seen. You know,
yeah,
it's like Bay of Blood, Deep Red, Bird with Crystal Plumage, and Tenebrae, or like those are the giallo films that you're probably have seen, even if you're not into giallo.
I would argue it's the least. It doesn't feel like a giallo to me a lot of the time. I'm actually a little uncomfortable referring to it as such, but it always gets played out as such. I think it's really a Agatha Christie body count movie, and it's really it's a dark comedy for the most part, and it's almost making fun of slasher movies that didn't exist yet. I mean, there were serial killer movies and body count kind of movies, but this is just a movie where it takes the Agatha Christie trying to remember which book that is it's Murder on the Orient Express, where everybody did it. It takes that to its extreme, where everybody is the killer and will keep killing each other, and there's no actual murder mystery. It's just that they're all assholes murdering each other over and over and over again.
Right.
It was released September 8th, and it goes by so many titles. The Italian title is
Ecologia del delitto,
which translates to Ecology of a Crime. But then there was also a different Italian title,
Reazione a catena,
which translates to Chain Reaction. And the Spanish title was Bay of Blood. In Western countries, it was released as Carnage, Twitch of the Death Nerve, which is probably the best title. And Bloodbath is another kind of lame one. I love Twitch of the Death Nerve. That's a great title all around. It's also the one that sounds the most giallo-esque. A Bay of Blood doesn't sound particularly giallo-esque. I mean, the lesson of this movie is, again, when we were talking about Bava, when we were talking about Black Sunday on the podcast about 1960 horror movies, it's just the theme here is Bava is once again ahead of the curve, doing stuff before everybody else does, and in a way that is also recalling what he had been watching himself and paying attention to himself. Most people will talk about how it is there's bits of the first two Friday the 13th movies stole from it. They stole a couple of the kills, and for some reason the sweater that Mrs. Voorhees is wearing is the same sweater that one of the male characters is wearing in this film. I think the thing that gets overlooked is that it has stuff in common with those Agatha Christie comedies that came out a little bit later. Robert Moore's Murder by Death, or the one that most people know as Jonathan Lynn's Clue. It's a super violent version of that, basically.
Sure. I will say this is a movie. This was my entry point to giallo. As little as it feels like a giallo, this is certainly the first one I watched, and it was because I was like, oh, I want to see where Friday the 13th came from. This is, now that I have a greater appreciation for giallo, in part because of preparing for this couple podcasts, this is sort of fallen in my esteem. Certainly when you compare it to some other Bava films like Black Sunday or Black Sabbath or Kill Baby Kill, like it's a little bit more slapdash. The photography is a little bit less striking. Bava is just someone who has a body of work that, they're some of the greatest masterpieces of the genre ever, and this is just sort of not on that level. So
it's a conceptual piece more than a
yeah,
artistically. Yeah, I mean,
I
he's using a lot of weird zooms and stuff, and to the point where I feel like he was just experimenting. Like he was using this entire film as an excuse to try to experiment with.
I think when you have something like this where the story doesn't matter and it is just silly, that is absolutely what you're doing. And this is a much more realistic context. It's him not working in the Gothic. It's him not working in a supernatural sort of palette.
He's also outdoors for a lot of the movie,
right?
And on location, not on sets.
So this does have just all across the board a little bit of a feeling of a lark. I think that what saves it ultimately is that it is so short. That it's just like you can't be bored because there's just so many murders and they happen so quickly, and then the movie's over. It just works on that level. I will say I think it's the insurance guy who comes down to sort of they're trying to dam up the bay or whatever. Every time I watch this movie, I forget what the plot is because obviously the plot's kind of meaningless. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is an Italian genre film. So that's definitely our protagonist because he's blonde and he's kind of treating a woman like crap. And then I'm like, wait a second, where does he go for the next 40 minutes? And every single time I watch this movie, I'm surprised that he is not the protagonist of the movie. And maybe this next time I watch it, it will stick. But that's like just a weird byproduct of I have certain expectations that this movie doesn't quite fulfill.
Yeah, I realize I've fallen off on describing the plots, but this one really is just heiress is killed and everybody wants the property that she has and are just murdering each other to get next on the inheritance. That's really the whole plot. The titular Bay of Blood is just this spot. It's a really good octopus cameo in this one. Bava has, and the gore is pretty extreme for 1971, but again, it has that playful quality. It was one of the movies that was banned in England as part of the video nasties, but it's always been one of those video nasties where you're like, really, this was going to make people go out and go crazy and murder babies. It's too, like, the blood is too bright. It is a lark 100%. And the only thing I worry about is that it's one of those many Bava movies that people watch with the Mystery Science Theater mindset, which is something that bothers me that Mystery Science Theater did Danger Diabolic, and I don't think it's their fault. I think it's part of their viewers' fault, where it's not supposed to be funny, and so we're laughing at it and not with it. I think that people can overlook how funny Bay of Blood is supposed to be,
right?
That they'll look at it as a very serious horror movie that of its time. It actually feels older than it is in a lot of ways. It feels like it was made in the mid 60s.
Yeah, so it's got 1 foot in the mid 60s and it's got 1 foot in the 80s.
And Bava made Baron Blood the next year, which we just talked about, which just feels so much more like a Bava movie. I don't think it's as enjoyable, but it's just much more Bava doing the 70s, I think. But yeah, that's all I have on that one.
Yeah, I honestly did not take a lot of notes just because it is just you've seen Bay of Blood. You're listening to Genre Grinder.
I put it on the list because if I hadn't, it would have gotten like 2 emails saying, why didn't you put that on the list?
Sure.
My 12 listeners, 2 of them would have been upset with me. So we'll move on to basically the polar opposite.
Oh my God.
which is Duccio Tessari's The Bloodstained Butterfly, which came out on September 10th. Italian title is
Una farfalla con le ali insanguinate.
And the German title translates to The Mystery of the Black Rose, which is meaningless. The butterfly actually has meaning as far as the plot goes in this one. This is I'm calling this a procedural.
Oh yes. Oh my God.
It is such a procedural that I used to really dislike it. But I think that I shouldn't say really dislike it. It was that I didn't really ever feel like watching it. It was one of those movies I just had in my collection because I wanted as many Giallo movies as I could. But watching it in the context of this podcast with all these other movies, it being so different made me like it a lot more. I have the feeling that you had the opposite effect.
I will say, seeing it a second time, knowing that where it ends up, sort of most of my complaints about this movie the first time is it is, especially in the first like 20 minutes, it is such a dizzying kaleidoscope of information.
Yes.
To the point, I do think it's a playful movie. It opens with Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 that turns into like a weird jazzy thing, and then back into Piano Concerto No. 1, and then back into the weird jazzy thing. And at a certain point, like a character is playing the piano in the score in the opening, and it opens with this quote: "The past does not exist, and that it is already gone. The future does not exist either, is that it is to come. Therefore, only the present exists, and but can be made up of the past and future. But it is the point where they meet." Like totally unattributed.
Yeah.
Just like, and then it's also like, that's not what this movie's about. There's something very playful about what it throws at you. It has almost these silent movie credits when it's introducing the cast of characters, that it's just like we are given no context. So it's like, oh cool, that's her husband. I don't know who she is. Like none of this is helpful. And
it's like it's again that Agatha Christie stage play thing where they like have to give you all the players first.
So I do think the first time I took it, I was trying to follow it seriously because it is a procedural and it does seem so detail oriented in terms of like, here's how we're dealing with this crime scene, and like literally like, here's how an Italian television studio functions. We're going to see all of the different crew members and everything talking to each other and working out this one shot before the sports show broadcast. And there's so many procedural elements that are so detail driven that trying to hold them all in my head drove me mad. And then I gave up, and then I was just sort of like in a bad mood for the last 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And then this time I watched it. I still think it like essentially doesn't quite work. And the real issue is that it has no protagonist. And in fact, it doesn't even have a character that we're given much of a dimension to for like the first 30 minutes of the movie. It's really goes so far, keeping us totally outside the psychology of every single person involved. Like the only like relatable character trait anyone gets is that like, oh man, the detective has bad luck with the coffee machine.
Yes, and I was just gonna say that's our big character moment is the detective, and it doesn't even feel like the detective actually hates the coffee. He enjoys complaining about the coffee to his like that's their banter.
Yeah,
that's the closest we get to any sort of romantic subplot in the movie.
So it is a movie that once it does shift into a different gear after the trial scene, and we do get into more of the less procedural and more giallo like mystery mechanics of here are all the different characters who have paired off and have these secrets, and they all have these things that we're learning about that changes how we thought of previous events and all that kind of thing. Like it's too late. We don't have an investment in any of it, and we do not care who stays in jail and who the murderer is. And so it's like I think it fundamentally doesn't work. But I really do appreciate its audacity. And for that first 30 minutes, I do think a lot of that, I think it like is a very striking looking movie on it, the way it is edited, and just everything about it is a very compelling thing for a while. And certainly the way, like you said, when you put it against all these other Giallo films that we watched, it's like, oh, this is something that's doing something wildly different, and you got to appreciate that a little.
Yeah, I mean I think the opening is kind of like if you decide not to care about following what's happening and you're just sort of going with it, it's really amazingly well edited. It's really interesting the way it's put together, and
it's a little Fritz Lang's M. In that way.
Yeah, that's a good one. I didn't think of that. Yeah, it's a little bit like that. It's like the ideas of neorealism, but super stylized. So like it's like capturing, it's like has this documentary feel to it. But I mean, I wonder if this was released the same year as I can look this up. It was released the same year as The French Connection. And I know the
Ah,
French Connection was a huge hit in Italy, but when would it have? I'm going to look up when the French Connection was actually released in Italy, because it reminds me of the way William Friedkin tries to do this sort of documentary thing, but also super stylized thing. Like he tries to do two things at once, and he
yeah,
does give us. It's really hard to really follow. French Connection and this both ultimately have a kind of simple mystery behind them,
yes.
but they are, what's the word? They're kind of hidden behind this mesh of,
They're obfuscated by
yes.
the style.
All right, so let me look release dates. French Connection came out in Italy in March. So it had, oh no, March of the next year. So no, it was not inspired by. It didn't come out until 1972. So it just happened to be on the same wavelength, which was something I know that there was like the Italian neorealist thing was coming to an end, and the French New Wave was the thing that the Americans were trying to mimic. But I feel like that has some of that same flavor in it. I really like the opening as a like a almost like a short film that you don't have to invest any sort of emotion or intellect in. You can just sort of just vibe with what's going on the street and in the studio and all that stuff.
The real thing it's like achieving by keeping us at arm's length is that as the story goes on and as we get into the trial, we genuinely don't know what to think in terms of who is guilty and who is innocent, because we really haven't been given enough to even formulate our own theories. So it is in that way closer to the sort of American television cop procedural where like an episode of Law and Order is not a whodunit. An episode of Law and Order is just like, just follow us. We're going to feed you everything you need to know. It's going to be a
As
slow
soon as you
unraveling.
say a famous person, you know they did it.
And in this way, like when you get to the trial and you hear the defense lawyer being like, "Oh yes, but of course, these elements can be found in this puddle." And you're like, "All right, well, I guess I wonder, we had that scene with the other guy. I don't know." I think it works at the beginning, and then I think it really goes for big melodrama at the end in a way that's totally unearned.
Yeah.
It's not merely that it gets more focused, it's that like tonally it tries to go more emotional and like tragic, and sort of like apocalyptic, like doomed, like these two characters like locked in a death spiral or whatever. That's just, yeah, that this does not
And
work.
it's not even that part's badly done, I don't think. It's just that it's not earned exactly.
Right.
I think that in it with the proper context before that, I think that would have been a very good climax for a different movie. I think that everything in it is done well, but it does feel kind of hammered together from parts.
It's a strange thing, that's for sure.
There's some really nice, I wrote down some of the little touches rewatching it. There's little clever things it does as far as the murder mystery go that I hadn't noticed before. There's a good one where they introduce one suspect and he has scratches all on his arm, and so as an audience we think, oh, he did it because they said that she defended herself. I have to really quickly say actual plot is female student is savagely killed in a park during a thunderstorm, and the culprit seems obvious, a TV sports personality who is seen fleeing the scene by numerous eyewitnesses. But while the evidence is damning, it's all too convenient. So we know we know that we're just given a bunch of suspects, and one, like, he has a bunch of scratches on his arm, so we think those were defensive wounds. But then the camera pans out, and we realize he's holding a cat, and that the cat is sort of ornery, so that the scratches are from the cat. And I just thought I hadn't, it just gone right over my head the first time I saw the movie, but rewatching it was like, oh, that's a clever little way of sort of planting seeds and then immediately unplanting the same seed in like the same shot. Technically, it's just it needed to pan out a little further. And I also think that this is another Ennio Morricone adjacent kind of score. It was Gianno Ferrio, and he's sort of taking the Morricone jazz and that Tchaikovsky piece, and then has this really it's like the theme from Love Story.
A little bit, yeah.
um yeah, and then there's a little bit of George Gershwin kind of New York City stuff going on too, and it really sets this slice of life tone that again, like you said, sort of falls away when they want us to have more investment in these characters that we don't really know. I want to say something about Tessari here is that he is an important figure for his uncredited story contributions to Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. See, he is one of many people who was on that film who might be in a particularly important a piece of the puzzle that was then sort of forgotten. And he went on to do the Pistol for Ringo and Return of Ringo, and a Zapata Western called Long Live Your Death. But he did make 3 Gialli. The first one was A Death Occurred Last Night, which is mostly remembered for being downbeat. It's another procedural overall. And then he made this one, and then he made Puzzle, aka The Man Without The Man Without Memory in 1974, which is the most patronizing mainstream super fun entertainment value movie. It is just one thing after another. It's the polar opposite of this movie. And I should also say that one of the stars here is Ida Gali, who went by the name Evelyn Stewart, and she's a very important Giallo star. She was in The Sweet Body of Deborah, the Weekend Murders, this film, Sergio Martino's The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, which we didn't cover because it's not as interesting as some of the other ones, Francisco Lara Palop's Murder Mansion, Lenzi's Knife of Ice, Romano Scalvolini's White Dress for Marielle, which I haven't seen but sounds like a Giallo, Bazzoni's Footprints, which we just talked about, Fulci's The Psychic, where she's actually quite good in that one. It's a very dramatic Giallo, and Stavello Massi's Angela the Black Angel, which is a late 80s Giallo revival thing. And then she's also in a dozen spaghetti western herself, and is in the Bava classics, Hercules and the Haunted World, and The Whip and the Body. Anything else on this one?
No.
Okay, let's keep moving on to so the last movie was the one that I had was the coldest on initially and grew to like on this rewatch. The next movie is the opposite, where I remember it being one of my favorites, but I didn't enjoy it as much rewatching it, which is Paolo Cavera's The Black Belly of the Tarantula, released on September 21st. Italian title
La tarantola dal ventre nero.
This is another procedural body count type movie. Cavara is one of the co-directors of Mondo Carne from 1962. He is one of the so-called godfathers of Mondo with, oh man, I can't pronounce these guys' names, Jacopetti and Prosperi. He also made Women of the World with those two, and then set off on his own to make Malamondo, then Witch Doctor Trials. He also sort of dramatized the making of Mondo Carne in a movie called The Wild Eye, and made one other lesser known Giallo in Plot of Fear. Otherwise, he's really not an important character to a lot of things. He just was one of the guys who was on there at the beginning of the Mondo boom. I believe you said you did not particularly like this one.
Oh no, I really did not. I think it has a very lurid premise of people being paralyzed, so they are sort of witnesses to their own death, feeling everything and seeing everything, but being unable to move or prevent it. Like, it's such a perverse thing. And then the movie itself just does not live up to it. There's not really any psychology to any of it. All of the sexuality in it is like the lowest brow, least interesting kind of thing. And really the thing I got the most out of this movie, the thing I enjoyed the most, is that the lead is so stupid. And the entire movie is this police detective being like, I don't know if I got what it takes to be a cop. I think I might not be cut out for this job. And then we just see him make terrible decisions the entire film. He's constantly doing incredibly stupid things and just being callous and endangering the investigation. And he's a horrible detective. And so it's like, yeah, no, you should quit. You should stop. But like, the movie is trying to be like, oh, but that the city needs him. These cops, they put themselves through this emotional turmoil, but really they got to do it because it's a thin line between the madness out there and the good people of Italy or whatever. And it's just like, it doesn't work because he is just such a goofus. And it's very lame. I don't know. There was nothing about this that I found very interesting. And it's, when there's not a hook like that and you have a plot that I just can't help to I don't have a chance of being able to follow. I just really get bored very quickly, and that was the case with this one. This is one of my least favorite movies we've talked about on these episodes.
Yeah, I think well, let me read the plot synopsis because I'm honestly forgetting now what what he's trying to do. I think it's just a generic one, right? It's just Inspector Tellini investigates a serial crime where victims have been paralyzed while having their bellies ripped open with a sharp knife. That's the plot synopsis on Letterboxd. Yeah, so it's the fact that the people are paralyzed and murdered while they're still like butchered while they're still. That's the big exploitation angle on this one, I feel. And it's made at a time. 1971 is not 1981. Like, you give Lucio Fulci that plot and he's going to make some nasty shit another 10 years after this, but it just doesn't really have the juice. My theory on what you're complaining about of the detective being an idiot is that they were trying so hard to make this Bird with the Crystal Plumage like movie that they took us, and this is entirely speculation on my part, that they took a script that had a police detective and that the movie might have already been attached to the actor Giancarlo Giannini, who's very famous. He's been in the original Swept Away in 1974, not the Madonna one. He was in Luciano Visconti's final film, The Innocent. He's in Coppola's section of The New York Stories, which is a particularly terrible film. He's the detective in Ridley Scott's Hannibal. He's a famous guy. So my theory is that he was attached and they had a script about a detective, but they wanted it to make it like Bird of the Crystal Plumage, where it's an amateur detective who doesn't know what he's doing and keeps getting deeper into a situation he shouldn't be in. So my theory is that they tried to combine these two uncombinable things, where you can't have a professional detective also be an amateur detective.
Yeah.
Unless it's like a Pink Panther movie.
I will say one thing that this takes from Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and something I was expecting to see in all these movies, but apparently it's not as essential to Giallo as I thought, is the red velvet box with the sort of fetishized weapon inside.
Yeah, I mean, I made a list of the things it rips off directly from Bird with the Crystal Plumage.
Go on. That's the one.
Well, I should say it rips off that from Bird with the Crystal Plumage and the idea of the idiot protagonist, like I'm thinking of. But it rips off a set piece from Blood and Black Lace. There are fashion mannequins in one of the murder scenes that's taken directly from Blood and Black Lace. It also rips off the look of the killer from Blood and Black Lace and Crystal Plumage, but it makes one weird change that actually kind of works. Instead of wearing the black leather gloves, he wears those old-fashioned semi-opaque surgical gloves, which make his hands look like these uncanny prosthetics.
Yeah, that
is genuinely icky.
Yeah, same with the killer in the Fifth Chord. It's a really gross glove.
Yeah, it's just it's a really glove. That's the pull quote for the DVD, is they're trying to find something positive Patrick said about this.
I'll let them put an exclamation point at the end of it too. It's a really gross glove.
Patrick Ripoll. Oh, Jesus. But they also take the foot chases from Crystal Plumage. You can't really credit Argento inventing people running in a murder thriller, but there's just something about the way that they film the foot chases that I think that was absolutely stolen from Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And the title was clearly a nod to, after Bird with the Crystal Plumage, you had to put animal names and everything: cat o' nine tails, case of scorpion's tail, lizard in a woman's skin. But they actually remembered to make the tarantula a part of the plot, which is something usually these movies don't remember. But it's actually a subplot where he's trying to break out drug ring thing. I'm trying to remember exactly the context of it. He's looking into what's causing the paralytic, and he comes across a guy who ships cocaine in the cages, these or the enclosures that he also ships poisonous spiders in, because they assume no one will break open to check the sand to realize it's cocaine. I don't know if spiders can absorb cocaine and get coked out. I don't know if that's a thing. They have a scene where this sinister doctor, who is being set up as a red herring but is clearly not the killer, he demonstrates that there's a kind of wasp that injects larvae into a spider, which he calls a tarantula. It's clearly not a tarantula. It's some other kind of spider. But this is a bad idea because he's already a suspect, and now he just looks like a morbid freak on top of being a suspect. It's just this really convoluted scene that ends with him being introduced as a red herring and then eliminated as a red herring within the same scene.
And it's a scene with real insect snuff. So all you animal snuff people,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
real
and
insect snuff in this, and then there's tomato snuff in the next movie. Which doesn't sound like it would be the equivalent, but we learn in the next movie it is in fact the equivalent when you see someone squash a tomato.
I actually like spiders for the most part, and I don't like seeing them killed. You know, you grow up in the desert, you see tarantulas, they're kind of cute. I don't know, some people hate them. So I do feel bad about the poor critter snuff. So yeah, I mean, it's a little disappointing revisiting this one. I should say, among the things ripped off from Birth of the Crystal Plumage, Ennio Morricone rips off his own score. There's some chaotic acoustic guitar riff thing that plays during the suspense scenes that seems like an original, but the rest of it is just outtakes. It's the same shit. It's kind of funny. Yeah, I mean, other than Mr. Giancarlo, this has Barbara Boucher in it, who most people will know it as a Playboy model and actress who appears in the original Casino Royale and the original television Star Trek. But she had a little run of giallo with included this movie, The Man with the Icy Eyes, Amok, which I talked about briefly earlier, the French Sex Murders, The Red Queen Kills 7 Times, which I talked about earlier, and Fulci's Don't Torture a Duckling. And then but we also got a double Bond thing here if you include the original Casino Royale as Bond. A Thunderball actress, Claudine Auger, is in this, and The Twitch of the Death Nurse, or I guess Bale Blood is what we're calling it. Oh, and then there's a third Bond girl in Barbara Bach, who's in The Spy Who Loved Me. She's also Ringo Starr's wife,
Yeah.
I think still currently, and appears in one more movie of the movies we're covering here today. Anything else on Black Tarantula?
Not particularly.
Tarantula.
Do you remember the motive for the murder?
Oh crap.
I don't necessarily want to start a 5-minute digression if it's a convoluted thing, but I was like, I'm looking at my notes and I see the name of the person who killed it, and I'm like, that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know why any of this happens.
It's okay. So the there's there's sort of 3 movies going on. There's the murder mystery, there's the cop thriller, and then there's a workplace comedy about a spa for hopeless middle-aged women.
Oh, that's right.
And
this movie sucks.
there's this very campy gay waiter who has the best line in the movie. The detective asks, "Are you married?" And he frowns, pauses, and says, "Oh my God, no." But there's a blind masseuse who is a great excuse for he does full, like, he's blind so women are comfortable being naked in front of him, but also he gives them very sexual massages, and it turns out that he's the killer. And I can't.
Is he faking his blindness?
He's faking his blindness.
Okay.
I can't remember his exact motive though. He might just be a psycho. I think it has something to do. It's being covered up by the woman who runs the spa for hopeless middle-aged women.
Yeah.
But I don't remember exactly what his I don't know. It's a favorite. It's one that is not on Blu-ray, so I'm curious as to why the rights are tied up somewhere. But maybe once it hits Blu-ray and people rewatch it and it looks nice, we'll kind of remember that it wasn't actually as good as we thought it was. I think it's just because it's so seedy and that we just fans remember it as being good, I think we're forgetting, we're confusing the two. But yeah, that's all I got on that.
All right.
Ready to move on to the final picture here.
I am.
And that is The Short Night of Glass Dolls, released in October 28th. It's directed by Aldo Lado. Italian title is
La corta notte delle bambole di vetro.
And a lot of other countries, it is just a variation on Paralyzed, which is a better title, but doesn't fill that giallo niche of needing a lot of extra words that sound mysterious and cool when placed together. I would call this an amateur detective crystal plumage type movie. So the twist on that is that the entirety of the movie is being remembered from the point of view of a character who is lying supposedly dead in the morgue and awaiting his cremation, and hoping that somebody will recognize that he's not actually dead, and trying to remember how he got to this place. So the whole story is recalled on his deathbed, essentially. That's the twist on the theme. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward amateur detective kind of body count movie.
It's a very striking opening.
Mm-hmm.
The premise of like a don't bury me, I'm not dead is like a very cool framing device for a ticking clock. I would say the issue for that thing is it's not really a ticking clock, because there's no implication at all that if he like can reverse engineer how this happened to him and piece together the story, which is how the story of the movie is told, like there's no indication that will help him in any
Mm-hmm.
way. So we're not like rooting for him to get to the center of everything. So it's just sort of, all right, we're kind of watching him. So all the hospital scenes, they like sort of hypothetically should have suspense, and they just don't. I would say, obviously, this is an episode of Genre Grinder where we are watching a lot of very visually striking movies. And I think Short Night of Glass Dolls, until it gets really sort of expressive and nightmarish, like it's not one of the better looking giallo films, especially in those hospital scenes. So this is a movie I really did not like the first time, and then when I rewatched it, I did sort of further appreciate that nightmarish element and how it doesn't come out of nowhere. But the problem is just the second act, that is the mystery of what happened to my girlfriend, why did she disappear, what's going on with these young women who are disappearing. It is the worst investigative story in a giallo I've ever seen. Like none of those scenes are interesting. He doesn't really run into any interesting characters. The way that the investigation plays out, it just is very slow. And I think this movie has a reputation. It is a sort of has a following, and I think that's almost entirely because of the ending and the framing device. But there is just a whole chunk in the middle where this movie is really boring. But on the other hand, there's parts, especially again at that ending, where it's just like I can't believe what I'm saying. This movie is so wild, and it just goes out of control in just a really fascinating way. And part of the reason it's fascinating is because it ties like this sort of political material into this more nightmarish sort of riff on. I don't know if it's a riff. I don't know the timeline of what came out first, this or All the Colors of the Dark, but certainly they're two very similar movies.
All Colors of the Dark came out just a little bit later in the next year.
Okay.
They're pretty close.
I would say like All the Colors of the Dark, which is my all-time favorite giallo, is like an example of like how you imbue an entire film with the sort of divine paranoid feeling that the best parts of this movie have. But like in general, those movies feel very similar to me. And there are parts of this that reach that height as well. So this is a movie I was mixed on, but I did overall vaguely positive on it.
I took way too many notes on this one just because it was one I hadn't reviewed before, and I was kind of interested in revisiting it. I'm gonna do my best to say why I think it has such a good reputation. Part of it is because it was available, just like a lot of these. But it's never been as good to me. For me, Lado's second one, Who Saw Her Die, from 1972, is his better giallo. That one's a really melancholy murder mystery, that it also takes place in a foreign land with someone who's out of sorts, and it just feels more like what he was trying to do. Whereas this one has a whole backstory of how many changes it went through. It went through different writers at one point. According to another Roberto Curti book, which is Italian Giallo film and television, Lotto says the final draft was written by Sergio Bazzini, who is a left-wing political writer, and that Antonio Margheriti at some point was attached to it. And he took over as director when the original director was fired, and then didn't really want to direct it. So he handed it off to Lotto, who was the writer on set, who then Lotto wanted to lean into the political part, but he couldn't get his locations. And so it has this really, so for me, it's definitely a compromised vision, I suppose. But Hussar Die is sort of like the Don't Look Now of Giallo movies. And then later he made Late Night Trains, Night Train Murders, which I talked about before, which I think is a genuinely great film. So the idea here for me, and what you're saying about how it has these parts that don't have any meaning to each other, it really feels like there was one movie they were making which was a political thriller. There was one movie that they were making that was a giallo that was fitting this mold of that made money. And then I feel like the third movie that is like an EC comic. It's the idea of someone on their deathbed hoping that someone will realize they're alive and won't stick them in the cremator. That whole part plays out like an AC comic to me, where he's just remembering something and not realizing his responsibility in a situation, like in Lizard in a Woman's Skin being his own unreliable narrator. That part feels like if you ham it up a bit, that's just like a good episode of Tales from the Crypt.
Sure.
You know, but like you say, I don't think all three of those things fit together. I do want to talk about the fact that Lotto rewrote the script, not originally wrote the script, while he was actually staying in Czechoslovakia. And he based it on the Prague Spring, which was just going to kind of go with the Wikipedia definition here, was a series of events and protests that shifted Czechoslovakian socialist republics politics. It split their parties. It led to intervention and invasion from the USSR and a period of media censorship known as the normalization. It was an event that deepened Western left-wing disillusionment with Soviets, and it's sort of the basis of various media, including the movie The Unbearable Lightness of, and a movie called Witch Hammer, which was included as part of Severin's folk horror set, that is a movie about witch burnings that is just a metaphor for the Prague Spring. So it's based on these really complex politics and being written by left-wing people who are dealing with disillusionment with a left-wing event. And so I think that they treat the politics pretty seriously, but I don't know if that fits the rest of the movie, is I think what the issue is. Maybe, I don't know, is that the issue you're having? Or do you think that the politics are just unnecessary?
Oh, I think the politics are okay. I mean, it's I'm not an expert on Prague Spring, and I'm sure
I just researched this.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is I'm sure everyone who made this movie was a lot more intimately familiar with it, as it was very recent history in Europe, you know. So like what they have to say about Prague Spring is more value than what I would have to say about Prague Spring or anything. It's not like a polemical film where I like watch it and I'm like invigorated politically. I think it just makes an interesting backdrop, and ultimately it's like a very simple metaphor that they come up with the old and rich, like eating the blood of, eating the young to stay in power. Right. Like it's not a very incisive look at politics. Like I think literally just the mechanics of the mystery plot once his girlfriend disappears are terrible, and that's a lot of the movie. And that's the I think that the him stuck in his body is presenting as a ticking clock, where it's like he's got to get out of it, but there's no reason for the viewer to have any reason to suspect that he might get out of it. So I just think I think that the framing device doesn't work as far as delivering suspense, and I think that most of the mystery doesn't work. I like his relationship. I like a lot of, there's actually this is before Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but it gets there first in terms of there are shots where the camera is pushing through a crowd of clearly not extras, and you just have people sort of like glancing at the camera. There's a lot of that paranoid feeling as his body is being transported from one floor to the hospital to the other. You see a shot through the elevator and you just see someone staring at him as the body goes past. And like, there's lots of little bits like that that feel like the best of Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And having an explicitly political plot makes all of that stuff work better. But I don't necessarily think it did not strike me personally as like a very deep movie in either direction. No. And certainly in this case, you know, because I am a leftist in 2023, I am going to take the reveal of Club 99, where these, you know, just bloodless uber rich people are snatching up and devouring young people. Like, I'm always going to take that as being like the 1%, as being capitalism or whatever. But obviously this being a post-Prague Spring, the people in charge, in power, who are suppressing the people are actually the communists. So that was a thing that in my very ahistorical view of this movie and its context, I maybe bristle at a little bit, but ultimately it's not a whole lot.
That's actually something I like about, and it's one of those things that does not apply to this movie, but to Italian like cult cinema in general, is that you have a lot of left-wing filmmakers dealing with like what they see as hypocritical, like a lot of the spaghetti westerns that are left-leaning are the sort of interest in them is that they don't come to the obvious conclusion when it comes to the leftist politics. And it's something I always found interesting, is that these movies are made by people that are obviously struggling with what it means to, like, they're the kind of people who are hanging out in coffee shops in France in the 60s and screaming and yelling at each other about their politics, you know.
But for that to be expressed in a movie, it needs to be a little more nuanced than what we get in this film.
Yeah,
that specific emotion of feeling conflicted and feeling ambivalent and feeling like something is slipping away is just like, it's just not within the capability of Short Night of Glass Dolls to tackle.
No, and that's and so again, that's like part of what I end up liking, is the idea that they tried to do this thing and failed, and it is more interesting than enjoyable, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Like, I think all the parts of this movie are really, and I mean, I think it's a half decent tragic romance too.
Do you think that this movie was an inspiration on the remake of Suspiria?
I never thought of that.
The remake of Suspiria takes place in the same setting, and there's a shot in this movie where someone opens a closet and then dumps a bunch of flowers on a comatose body that is just like propped up in the closet. It's like one of the most fucked things I've ever seen. It is so effective. It's so overwhelming and powerful and bleak and upsetting. And it's been too many years now since I saw the Suspiria remake, but I remember there's a specific shot in the Suspiria remake that, like, I think a cop starts investigating the dance school, and then at a certain point you see what happened to the cop, and I remember feeling the exact same way. And I wonder if I watched these two back to back, I would see more connections, or if this is it's just those two elements. But it was just something that came to mind.
I don't really know anything about the guy who made the Suspiria remake.
I mean, it's director of Call Me by Your Name and the new Timothée Chalamet movie, and several films. But
I'm not really familiar with what his what he watched. I mean, if he remade Suspiria, he probably watches some of this kind of stuff.
He is an Italian filmmaker, so
yeah, no, I hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting connection. I think what ultimately what I come down to is I think that there's either a decent episode of Tales from the Crypt if you remove most of it, or if you really restructure it, there's an interesting missing person mystery. I mean, there's also scenes with where they're trying to set up red herrings, and so that ends up taking a lot of its energy away. And so I wonder if they remove the giallo element entirely, if it would have maybe been a better movie.
Or yeah, and again, like I already made this reference, but like All the Colors of the Dark is a movie that the entire film is just really keyed up and bombastic, and just the camera work and the style and the music and everything, you just feel anxious and you feel like you're trapped in a nightmare and things are spiraling out of control. And it's just one of those things where it's like, if there weren't so many elements of this movie that felt prosaic, if there weren't so many scenes of just like reporters chatting, like I
Yeah.
think a lot of this other stuff might play better. And to be fair, like Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a movie that actually has a lot of the dynamics of the sort of newsroom in this movie, with the way that the sort of colleagues and friends in that film are sort of conversing with each other and looking around at what's happening to them and sort of eyeing each other with suspicion. But it works in that movie, and just for whatever reason it doesn't here.
I should say that it was one of the people who rewrote this script, Ernesto Gastaldi. He did write All the Colors of the Dark and Torso and Suspicious Death of a Minor and Scorpion with Two Tails. And So Sweet, So Perverse, which the Lenzi movie. So that actually might have, the connection you would make to All the Colors of the Dark might be more of an issue of this one writer kind of going through his thing more than Aldo going through his thing. I would recommend people see this and just sort of keep in mind that it's just sort of a little too much, but that when it works, I think like Who Saw Her Die, it has really good sense of despair to it.
Yeah. I think yeah, and it's free on Tubi. It's one of a couple movies that we've talked about that is sort of just streaming free somewhere. But I would definitely say it's worth checking out.
Otherwise, a last thing is that my favorite quote in this movie is that. So yeah, that'll bring us to the end.
Yeah.
There's some other movies that came out this year that maybe we could have covered. I will personally recommend The Designated Victim, which is a variation on Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train. And also, I mean, I didn't want to cover two Argento movies, but Four Flies in Grey Velvet was the last of this list of 42 movies. It was the last one to be released that year. And it is a pretty interesting movie. I think most people like it better than Cat o' Nine Tails. I just wanted to talk about Cat o' Nine Tails instead, unfortunately for Patrick's sake.
Oh well. I will say I just went back and we watched 12 movies and I have positive feelings about 8 of them.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So I was thinking like, oh yeah, I already know I like 2 of them and I might like 2 or 3 more. So I was pleasantly surprised. And maybe this did turn me around a little bit. Maybe I'm a little less skeptic. I'm a little bit more of a believer in the power of Giallo.
Someday down the line, I'll figure out what connects the ones you liked, and then I'll force you to watch other ones.
I just like the good ones, I think. I think that's really, it's like there's a lot of bad ones, but the good ones, they're good.
Well, I'll make it my I'll watch the 20 of these I haven't seen yet, and I'll let you know.
Okay, excellent. I appreciate it.
Oh, one more that's really good. The Glass Ceiling is a Spanish one by Eloy de la Iglesia, who
great filmmaker.
I know. Yeah, great filmmaker, which is his version of Rear Window, and I quite like that one. So that's the other one I'll recommend from this list. And I don't know. We'll think up another thing like this for next year or later this year. I don't know. What were the other things we were thinking of? The number one year for giant monster movies?
Yes, 1957 had several. It was sort of the watershed year for American giant monster movies, and after that, they kind of stopped making those like post-nuclear disaster kind of giant monster films. So there's that. I was thinking, just because on one of the podcasts I have, 96 Greers, our upcoming episode is going to be on The Wedding Planner starring J-Lo. And I was thinking of going back and watching the rom-coms of the Bush era. I think if you go from the year 2001 to the year 2008, you're going to probably see the peak and the fall of the American rom-com in that time period. So that wasn't something I had interest in. We have an idea for October that we maybe don't even want to give the premise yet. But I think if fans of the horror shows that we did on Directors Club, I think we'll be very pleased by what we have prepared for Halloween.
Yeah, and then the other one I thought of is I can make Patrick watch spaghetti westerns, because 1966 is very clearly, without question, the best year for spaghetti westerns.
Oh yeah. I've my experience is limited, but like I'm a fan of Compañeros. I'm a fan of Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and Django.
I think most people just prefer spaghetti westerns to Giallo, and it makes sense. I get it. All right, so as per usual, you can find me on Twitter at Gabe M, as in Matthew Powers. There's a Genre Grinder Twitter. There's a Genre Grinder Gabe on Instagram, which I'm trying to remember to upload to, because that's new to me. Genre Grinder Facebook, and of course the Genre Grinder website, where I am trying to upload at least 2 new reviews every week, and I've gotten on some good mailing lists, so I have some cool Blu-rays and 4Ks coming up for review. Where can they find you, Mr. Patrick Ripoll?
Well, I got 3 podcasts. 2 of them are on the Now Playing Network. One of them is Uptown Song Club. It's a podcast about music where it's fully edited, where I put in sound clips of the music we're talking about. So if someone mentions the bass line, you'll hear the bass line. It creates a sort of sound collage experience while also maintaining the sort of chat show format of most podcasts. I have Tracks of the Damned, where I record commentary tracks for horror movies. Gabe's been on a bunch of them. I would definitely recommend our commentary track for Martin. That Blu-ray just got delayed, but it will still come
as of today. Yeah, we're recording this on Happy Valentine's Day. We're recording this on Valentine's Day, and just before we started talking, they delayed the fucking
but that's a particularly good episode. And then I have a podcast, 96 Greers, where we cover the career of character actor Judy Greer, one film at a time. Everything from Oscar bait like The Descendants to direct to Hulu horror movies like Good Boy to the upcoming Wedding Planner, where she plays J-Lo's best friend. That's fun. And then I'm on the internet, just on Twitter at Uptown Song Club, on Instagram at Uptown Song Club, and I'm on Mastodon, which is linernotes.club/Uptown Song Club, or at Uptown Song Club at linernotes.club. At some point I'm going to get it right, but Mastodon's a little hard to figure out, so just keep searching, you'll find it
eventually. All right, well, thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks for sitting through 2 whole episodes of this with us. Talk to you next time.
Bye.
Look out, mouth. Watch out, hips. I'm bringing the world's fastest soft drink to my lips.
Mellow yellow makes you feel so good, so fast. From your head down to your toes. Mellow yellow makes you feel so good, so fast. You just can't drink it slow.
Look out, mouth. Watch out first. This mellow yellow's as